To whom was the letter of Galatians written? That's a matter of significant debate in scholarship, and it's actually quite a technical matter. One might ask, why does it even matter? It actually doesn't affect so much the interpretation of the letter, but how we put things together historically. It relates to how we correlate the letter of Galatians with the book of Acts in particular. And there's some interesting issues in there. Did Peter's defection in Galatians chapter 2, 11 through 14, did that occur after the apostolic council in Acts chapter 15? And then another issue that arises is, did Paul avoid mentioning some of his visits to Galatians in chapters 1 and 2? So we're just going to explore this issue for a bit. Galatia was a Roman province. It became a province in 25 BC. So did Paul write the letter to North Galatia, the areas in the north of modern-day Turkey, or did he write it to South Galatia, the cities he visited in Acts chapter 13 and 14? So let me mention a couple of arguments for why people think that Paul wrote to North Galatia. And the first is, Paul would not use the term Galatians to describe those living in South Galatia, for they were not Galatians ethnically. So in other words, Paul would use a term that would relate to the cities he wrote to in the north. But then the question is, what other term would Paul use to describe the Galatians? For those living in the province of Galatia came from many ethnic groups. Only the term Galatians would be sufficiently comprehensive to include all of the Galatians. Secondly, one of the strongest arguments for supporting the North Galatian view is the relationship between Acts 15 and Galatians 2. Those who support the North Galatian view argue that Acts 15 refers to the same events that we see in Galatians chapter 2. So if you adopt this view, the chronology of Paul's visits to Jerusalem are as follows. Acts 9 verses 26 through 28 is equal to Galatians 1, verse 18. Acts 11 and 12 then is skipped in Galatians. That's very important to note. And Acts 15 is equivalent with Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. So if we see Acts 15 and Galatians 2 when Paul goes to Jerusalem, and Acts 15 is the apostolic council, if we see those two events as the same events, the arguments in favor of correlating those two is actually quite strong. First, the subject in both texts is the same. The matter of debate, that's circumcision. Second, the place name is the same, and that's Jerusalem. Third, the people involved in the debate are the same. That's James and Peter and John and Paul and Barnabas. And fourth, the decision was the same. Circumcision was not required. So I hope you see those are significant arguments for thinking that we have the same events taking place in Acts 15 and Galatians chapter 2. However, there's also significant support for the South Galatian theory. Remember, the South Galatian theory is the notion that Paul wrote to the churches listed in Acts chapter 13 and 14 on his first missionary journey. So here's the first argument. Peter's lapse in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, makes better sense before the apostolic council of Acts 15, which is in AD 48. I mean, why does it make better sense? Because they hadn't decided yet on what to do regarding Gentiles coming into the church. Second, one of the stronger arguments for the South Galatian hypothesis is that Paul would not have neglected any of his visits to Jerusalem in Galatians 2. He wanted to demonstrate in these chapters his independence from the Jerusalem apostles, and he demonstrates that independence by recording carefully each of the visits he made. So on this reading, on the South Galatian reading, the visit to Jerusalem recorded in Acts chapter 15 is omitted in Galatians because the council described in Acts 15 had not yet occurred when Paul wrote the letter. So we have seen above the most serious objection to this scenario is that Acts 15 and Galatians 2 are remarkably similar. At both meetings, circumcision was debated. The apostles decided that circumcision was not required for the salvation of the Gentiles. Is it possible that the same meeting took place on two occasions? And I want to say here, yes, it is possible. Such things do take place in history where you have debates and then those debates are revisited again. Actually, in church history, this took place at Nicaea. You had things decided at Nicaea, and then these things were revisited again. So many defenders of the South Galatian hypothesis respond by emphasizing that the meeting in Galatians 2 was of a different nature than the council in Acts 15. The meeting in Galatians 2 was a private meeting, while the meeting in Acts 15 was a public discussion. So in Acts 15, we see an official deliberations with a formal decision. But in Galatians, we see an informal meeting and a private judgment. Furthermore, South Galatian proponents would claim that Paul would have informed the Galatians what the council decided if the events of Acts 15 had already transpired. That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If they'd already decided circumcision was not required for salvation, Paul would have informed the Galatians in the letter of such an important decision. The fact that Paul says nothing about the decision of the council indicates that the council had not yet occurred. So let's think again about Paul's visits to Jerusalem, which you have before you there on the screen. You see, again, in Galatians, Paul's conversion is recorded for us in Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 through 17. In Acts, Paul's conversion is in chapter 9. Galatians chapter 1, verse 18. 3 years after Paul's conversion, Paul makes his first visit to Jerusalem. Then in Acts 9, he goes with Barnabas to Jerusalem. So Galatians 1, Acts 9, that's the same visit. Galatians 2, 14 years after Paul's conversion, he goes to Jerusalem again, and that correlates with Acts 11, verses 27 through 30, which is the famine relief visit to Jerusalem. In between those events, or subsequent to that event, you see the dispute in Antioch with Peter, which perhaps correlates with the beginning of Acts 15. And then on this scenario, the council in Jerusalem took place after Galatians was written. So, we don't know these matters for sure. It's hard to be certain on this matter. It's not decisive for interpreting the letter, but historically, I think the best argument is that Paul probably wrote to the South Galatian churches, the churches he wrote to and he visited in Acts 13 and 14. So I prefer that reading at the end of the day. So that brings us to the date of the letter. When did Paul write Galatians? The date of the letter, I hope you understand, is determined by the question of the recipients. If you hold to a North Galatian date, you're going to date it differently than if you hold a South Galatian date. So if one holds to a South Galatian hypothesis, and places the letter before the events of Acts 15, then Galatians is the earliest Pauline letter, or at least it may be. And it may be have written as early as AD 48. So this letter would be extraordinarily early. If, however, one accepts a North Galatian hypothesis, the letter was written somewhere between AD 50 and 57. So again, it's not decisive for the interpretation of the letter, but I think there are good grounds for thinking that Paul wrote this as his earliest letter, and that it was written to the churches he evangelized in Acts 13 and 14.